Thanks, Martin, for the introduction. I noticed at some point you said it's not all doom and gloom. That seems to be a typical what comes out of us academics when we want to send a positive message. It's not all doom and gloom, right? In fact, I think there is a lot of positive things to be said about the energy transition, next to the fact that we may be a bit late. But the sense of urgency is enormous. The technical ability to do stuff at scale is likewise enormous, and none of that was in place a decade ago. So we're at the cusp of a breakthrough, and hopefully, and I think seriously, a massive acceleration of things. So the work that I'm going to talk to you about was developed in the context of the Sustainable Industry Lab, which I won't say a lot about, but we have a website where you can look at us. And the focus is on what if we go through the transition, if we reach all the targets that we say we want to reach in 2050. So that's zero carbon emission, running our nation and the world on renewable energy, and having all carbon circular. What does that mean? And a plan that adds up is actually a quote stolen from David McKay of Sustainable Energy Without the Hot Air fame. It was a wonderful slogan. Back over a decade ago, he said to us, well, let's look at what our targets on energy then mean for the UK, right? Can we do it? What are the implications? Well, what I'm going to talk about is quite similar, but then for energy and for carbon in the Netherlands. And it relates to, transformation of the industry. But as you all know, the fuels industry is magnificently large in the Netherlands. So that is my perspective. First, I think this will always come in handy, right? So this is the future of fuels in one slide. Different sectors, the four sectors that you all know. On the left, what it is now, and on the right, what different credible European Commission, I think is EC and IEA, say it will be by 2050. Well, it's a crowded slide, but it can be summarized quite easily. Today, basically, it's all fossil hydrocarbons, give or take a few percent. And on the right, well, per sector, I think we have a pretty clear perspective, right? It's electricity, period, for passenger cars. It's electricity and hydrogen, and maybe a bit else for heavy-duty vehicles. And shipping and aviation will still rely on non-fossil carbons. So this may be a bit of a crude summary, but I think it's a very helpful summary, and it's precisely the sort of level of detail, or actually lack of detail, that inspires the work that I'm going to talk about. Now, as I mentioned, the Sustainable Industry Lab is about thinking what is the future of Dutch industry, and there's a lot of lenses that you can apply, technical lenses, economic lenses, fairness, and if you think about that, this is a bit, okay. If you take all these four themes on the left into account, what we as a group set out to do is derive, if you look at it at a pretty high level, at a very high level, can you come to a sensible scoping of what could be an aspired portfolio of Dutch industry? And why would that be useful? And what about that fifth column there, governance? You would think that once you have a sense of what an aspired portfolio is, where you want to be going to, that should be your guiding direction for anything that you could term green industrial policy. So where are we headed to, and what is an aspired portfolio? Well, it says here industry, but the focus in my presentation today, as generally, is really about refining and fuels production, right? And once again, it's about in the Netherlands. That is a limitation, of course. I mean, we're connected in the world, but it gives focus to the work. And a lot of discussions, as in the Platform Duurzame Brandstoffen, are local. So I think it's not a complete picture, but it's a very good start, and especially relevant for us. So if this is the industry portfolio, right, in a cartoon, then it's now Well, frankly, all fossil-based, right? There is a bit of other stuff, but it's still, things are growing, right? It's not all doom and gloom, as Martin said, and as I would echo. But the transformation that is still ahead of us is phenomenal, right? So we need to get fossils out, and biomass, waste, and CO2 are the new sources as far as hydrocarbon products go, right? And hopefully from that industry portfolio by the middle of the century, it will have essentially no emissions, and whatever emissions there are get recycled either as waste or as CO2, right? And hopefully there'll still be some income and a relevant contribution to the Dutch economy. Now, what does that mean at a very high level? Basically, sometimes it's a surprise, but fundamentally, we leave the fossil era, which also means that resources are no longer abundant. I mean, it sounds a bit silly to speak about oil and gas as abundant in this time of crisis, but over the years and over the decades, fundamentally it is, right? That's the story of the past 2 centuries, right? It's abundance driven, underpinned by fossil fuels. So my take, our take, is that will not be the case. That's not always appreciated because there is plenty of sunlight, but really when you talk about delivering renewable energy, and when you think about sources of non-fossil carbon, that's biomass and waste and probably CO2, all of it is basically constrained. So we have to think about a portfolio of conversions of industry basically in a constrained world. So that in a way is bad news, right? So it's new news, or it's news, but it's not. There are definitely upsides as well, because we basically go in this domain of hydrocarbon conversions for chemicals and fuels. That's the scope of my focus. We go from basically being a resource importer and just doing conversion to a situation and an economy where basically we leave behind the conversion-only industry, but significantly do also production, right? And the conversion itself becomes, well, more difficult, but that means, of course, also in economic activity and in capital investment, etc., just more scope for economic activity. So it's a good story, right? If you think also for the government, right, you're talking about with basic industry that fundamentally volumes go down, but margins, upgrading margins go up, right? So we'll see where that pans out. But in first instance, there are 2 large forces working in different directions, so that you can't say, and you can be hopeful actually that this is just as large an industry economically in a sustainable future. Now, the rest of my work, building up to what are the contours of an aspired portfolio, represent a choice of sorts, but fundamentally the choice I'm going to make is one of technological efficiency, right? So power where power can be used, then hydrogen, then hydrocarbons, and hydrocarbons are preferentially made in the most efficient manner, right? So if you have a hydrocarbon, see to it that it gets as directly to a product as you possibly can. Well, with those guiding principles, you can have a look at the makeover of the energy system, but also the industrial energy system. So, and this is something you all know. So there's a few slides now to make an introduction and introduce a sort of a pie chart that I use. It's basically a gimmick more for a general public. You say, actually, people always need to remind that how little a part the energy that we all experience is, right? For all our living, right, our personal energy use, as well as all the energy use of the service sector, is only 25% of what goes on in this country in terms of energy. But it's 80% of the economy, and it's all our private lives and all our personal consumption, insofar as not embedded in stuff, of course. So that's the inner core, and we'll see that that's actually in a way easy. But there is an outer shell, which in particular in the Netherlands is awfully big, right? And you all know this, but it's good to remind people. It's 3 times as large. And now here's the other thing. in the Sustainable Industry Lab, we set ourselves the task to make clear that the way to reach the targets in a meaningful way is not to wish that away and say, well, somebody else will do it better, but to focus the mind and say, how can we in the Netherlands build a sustainable industry and deliver a sustainable contribution in the world in 2050 in order that globally we reach the targets. But I made sort of a wedge in this just to remind ourselves that the Netherlands is part of a very open economy, right? But actually the long and the short of it is that in the Netherlands we do more for the world in terms of energy and emissions than the world does for us, certainly when it comes to energy conversions, etc., which again makes the Netherlands quite special, and it makes it a very urgent task for us in the Netherlands to think this through and have a joint story about this. Well, basically, quickly about it, I think there are three lenses which are at the same time constraints, and I'm going to take you through two of them, and then we have a pretty good story. One is, what can we do in the Netherlands with green energy, which means now power and so power and hydrogen. Green energy, green power, green hydrogen. The other is circular carbon, because power and hydrogen are, well, lack the carbon, and there is an awful lot for which we still need carbon, chemicals as well as fuels. And finally, a very important constraining factor, but I just won't have the time to cover that, is time. And that brings about interim solutions, complicates the picture, but not fundamentally alters, we believe, the direction of where you should be heading towards in the longer term. So here's our pie chart, but now broken down in big segments. And it's nice to say that there's a color coding here, because there are three different challenges. The inner one, personal transformation and the built environment, that's essentially it. Well, it's not so large energy-wise, and actually hydrogen and green power can do it. And as you do that, there's awfully big efficiency gains, right? So this is an easy one. I mean, I do appreciate all the real world difficulties and the time it will take, but fundamentally this is not where the resource constraints play out. Interestingly, when you look at the next sector, the energy that we use in industry, well, you can see, if you take the lens of efficiency, that will also in the future predominantly rely on hydrogen and power. Well, here, because energy is industry is already efficient, the efficiency gains are not as large, but as we will see, it's still in scope with what we can energy-wise resource in the Netherlands. That leaves us with a third one, which is also the topic of today. What about basically, you might say, the oil wedge around it? And it's huge. It's in particular huge in the Netherlands. And why is it? Well, because we have all these refineries, right? We do the refining. We make the oil products for, well, a significant chunk of Northwest Europe. We have an enormous export-oriented chemical industry which needs feedstock. And air and shipping, bunkering, is huge. Bunkering, so air and shipping in the Netherlands, is 25% compared to the inland energy use. Take our neighbor country in Germany, it's only 5%. Right? So the difference is striking, and it's interesting when you do this talk how little people in policy arenas are aware of this. So sending this message and telling that in Europe we're different than the others, that is, I think, a very important one. Now, the lens of green power and green hydrogen. Suppose that you want to do everything starting with the ultimate technologist's dream, right? From green power comes green hydrogen, we couple it to CO2, and then we have e-fuels. Well, what you'll see is that takes a lot of energy, right? In particular, it takes a lot of green electricity, in particular for that oil displacement, right? In all likelihood, that just won't be enough, right? Well, we're constantly upping the ante and saying, well, we want more wind on the North Sea, but there are limits to this, right? So round about 1500 is sort of the high end of what is in the various scenarios for Dutch green power generation. But it's actually, when you look at where the green and the blue is, it's actually good enough for the inner circle, for our personal energy use and service sector, as well as to keep industry running, right? To keep the industry powered. But it leaves an open question: what about all the hydrocarbons, right? What about remaining fuels, and what about chemical feedstocks? I think if you look at this and what it would mean to have e-fuels and e-chemicals take a major share, then it's an enormous demand on energy. You might also say it's basically not technically efficient, right? It's definitely worthwhile, perhaps somewhere, but you got to have the energy, right? And well, we see in the net that is a constraining factor. So maybe it works someplace else, but maybe not here. But so what about that oil wedge then, if you will? So at the moment, that's all imported oil, right? It's about 1 million barrels of oil per day that's imported into the Netherlands and converted into products. This is where it goes. And the good news, it's not all doom and gloom, to quote Martin, it will go down, right? And that's basically on the consensus outlook, what I said at the beginning, right? So in crude cartoonish terms, right, all we will be left with by the middle of the century is shipping and aviation. It might be a bit more subtle, right? But in terms of the scope, that's roughly it, right? Well, that brings us then to the question, if oil is out as a source, what might replace it? Well, I think the answer is twofold. Waste, biomass and CO2. Well, I just said, well, CO2 is maybe the thing of last resort. One thing, we have too little of it available in the Netherlands. This is a rough estimate of what would be available in the Netherlands in terms of waste and biomass, and all converted to megatons of pure carbon. But if you look at what could be imported, given also that we're a significant exporter, that is quite plausible if we have the energy available to do the conversion. But also, in order not to strain things too much, right, we would say, no, the clicker is a bit, the performance is, here we go. I think the battery is running out. So I think what we come out is just to put a placeholder. It would be good if you have to speak about an aspired portfolio to say, well, something like between 10 and 20 megatons should be our aspired conversion portfolio in an all renewable, all circular world. Let's take the upper limit, 20 megatons. We can plausibly resource it. I won't go into it, but that is not stretching it, right? It's just saying we do more for the world than our fair share, and hence we need to import stuff. Now basically, for that, you would need green power and green hydrogen. Depending on the choice of technology, it would be a lot. And here's perhaps the crudest guess that is, but I would guess as a placeholder number, it would perhaps need 500 petajoules to do that conversion. I think we'll work on that to make it better, but this is a very high level assessment for all its flaws. That would leave you with an image. We now have the carbon, and we have an image, a picture of what it would mean in terms of total energy demand. So roughly that works out well. It stretches the limits to what we now say should be done in terms of our own renewables generation, but in a way we come quite close. So I would say this is, well, thickness of the line may be a bit exaggerating, but this more or less is. I think it's ambitious, but it's feasible, and it makes sense if you take into account the local resources, the legacy that we have, which is quite valuable. And so I think this can credibly serve as a version 0 for an aspired portfolio. Now that brings me just about in time to the conclusions of this work. There is a lot of assumptions going in, right? And each of them are fantastically impactful in their own right? It all goes massive electrification wherever it can. It makes full use of, in particular, the offshore wind resource, which in Northwest Europe is, of course, a huge and a fantastic resource base. So we're almost honor bound to develop and use that. Green hydrogen is something, right? That I think is a big, that perhaps is the biggest technology uncertainty that hangs over it, right? The scale up, the timing of the electrolyzer scale up. Maybe and we need to build an import position, a supply position for waste and biomass. And I think this is in the current political context something that needs to be said, I think, right? If you think about circularity and what that means for Dutch industry, it means that ultimately you will have to rely on biomass and waste, both of them, right? You can be a bit nuanced about it, say, well, it should be biomass waste or so, but really, I think biomass now has such a bad name that basically it's difficult to foresee that we can, it's impossible, I think, to envisage that we can build our basically the basis for our material well-being in a circular world without relying for a significant extent on biomass. It should be sustainable, but it can be sustainable. And in terms of supply lines, right, it's only 30 years, right, building it up. So we have one now, we should build it out rather than dismantle it. So I think that's an important message. The final two things, if I can make this thing to click again. So this is basically a word of caution, right? I think, as I hopefully have convinced you, it makes sense to think about what does it mean for our country, if only to inform our Dutch discussions, which are important. But countries are different, I bet. So I think this basically, we said we can energy-wise, at least on green energy, be almost energy self-sufficient. We still need to import the carbon, which also has energy. But the situation may well be different for neighboring countries and for other countries. So that might also lead to different technology choices elsewhere. But I think if you look at this, I would say never mind the role of e-fuels and chemicals in a global world. This analysis would de-emphasize it for use and for rollout in the Netherlands. Perhaps, or maybe hopefully, that is a provocative statement, but this is all about provocation and having a good, honest discussion. And I hope that with this, I've given you some ammunition to enjoy the rest of the day. Thank you very much for your attention.